afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here on the second day of the Curators Intensive Taipei 19 International Conference. My special thanks to Chairman Limandi and Director Lim Ping for hosting us for this significant event. Of course, we cannot ignore Amy and her team's tremendous organizing effort to bring us here. If the subject of concerns from the presentation yesterday is about the exteriority of the curatorialship in relation to the institution and modulation of reception on art through the performative and educational turn in curatorial practice, the focus of today will shift to the political interiority of the concept of curation and the practice of curatorialship in the post-colonial moment in this very age of globalization. It is a great honor to have Professor David Tay to kick off our discussion today with his keynote presentation titled, "What is Curatorial Function?" David is a writer, curator, and associate professor at the National University of Singapore, specializing in Southeast Asian contemporary art. His curatorial projects have included Returns, 12 Gwangju Biennale 2018, Misfits, Pages of Loose-Lived Modernity, Hakave, Berlin 2017, Transmission, Jim Thompson Moss Center, Bangkok 2014, to name a few. Tay's essay has appeared in Third Text, After All, Art Foreign International, Theory, Culture, and Society, and Art and the Margin. His book, Thai Art, Currencies of the Contemporary, was published by MIT Press in 2017, and he was the co-editor with David Morris of Artist to Artist, Independent Art Festival in Chiang Mai, 1992 to 1998, 2018. Apart from all these impressive achievements, David was also the founding director and the now defunct Future Perfect. For me, the Future Perfect is one of the most significant experiments on the model of a gallery and institution in Singapore by far. David, please accept our appreciation for your effort to take time out from the extremely busy schedule of teaching, academic, research, and all other professional commitment and family commitment. Without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, Fang Tzu. Thank you to the museum, and thank you to the Cube, and thank you to the other organizers for your tremendous efforts bringing us together. I'm sorry, firstly, that I wasn't able to join you yesterday. And secondly, I'm also sorry if my voice kind of gives way today. I haven't been very well, so let's hope I can stick it out. Now, today I'm going to try to undermine some assumptions about curators, about what they do and what they are. So I want to be upfront about some assumptions of my own that I won't really have time to unpick. I'm going to mention briefly just three of these. First, the curators I'm talking about, at least to begin with, are the independent ones who emerged in the second half of last century and have since achieved an importance as great as anyone else in the arts system. These curators are obviously rather different to the curators of previous eras. Secondly, that they've somehow seemed specially tied to, not to modern art, but to contemporary art, by which I mean not simply, chronologically, the art of the present, but that art of the present qualified, ideologically if you like, by contemporaneity, by value judgments made by curators and others. Thirdly, a geographical assumption. In keeping with today's theme, I'm going to refer broadly to Asian contemporary art, more specifically to Southeast Asian, and in fact I'll toggle somewhat imprecisely between those regions. Some of what I describe will be familiar to East Asians, some probably will not. I apologise for that, but it's precisely in order to provoke these comparisons that I presume today to speak of Asia. Further, my notion of contemporaneity is native to the so-called free world more than the socialist countries, which of course nowadays share in the contemporaneity of a brisk transnational exchange. We shouldn't assume they lacked it before 1989, but the curators of the post-colonial capitalist Pax Americana did much to set the terms of engagement that we now call global, and to establish constructs like Asia and Southeast Asia that today frame our research, our exhibitions, and our markets. Now, recently we've seen efforts to breathe new life into art history, a discipline with a new global scope, but whose institutional and discursive foundations turned out to be rather less than worldly. One might have thought independent curators could be useful here. These frequent flyers have long been a core user group and indeed contributing authors of art history, but they've become estranged from that discipline as their role drifted from conservation towards exhibition, from keeper of objects to handler of artists, and author of contemporaneity, less and less concerned with the past, with objects and with collections, and as their stature has grown. For better or for worse, the curator's independence has won them unprecedented attention. Historicisation of the role didn't take long, first by the principals themselves, in collected writings, interviews, position statements and memoirs, some of them obviously ghost-written, some close to vanity publications, by that cohort of nomadic, gigging, independent curators who by the 90s were already more influential than the big artists of the day. A few notes about this. First, that the biographical logic inaugurated by Vasari in the 16th century was transferred here to a new art historical protagonist. Nobody would have thought of publishing memoirs of the sedentary, bookish curator that kept keeper of the Royal or State Museum collection. Secondly, note the prevalence of the interview. The curator emerges as discussant or perhaps ventriloquist in chief of the contemporary, still clearly authorial, but their authority residing more in speech than in writing, in an immediacy, not in scholarly or critical reflection. Thirdly, while such writings assemble stables of artists, identifying prospectus for new investment, this coincides with a deprivileging of the artist vis-à-vis other professions. Architect, designer, geek, entrepreneur, rebranded as creative agents of cultural innovation. And fourth, this kind of publication coincides with the most rapid expansion of the global art circuit, especially biennials, and the curator's anointment as champion of the frictionless circulation of global neoliberalism itself. We might then understand their independence as dependency on that neo-capitalist system more than, say, liberation from the collection or the museum. More circumspect and self-critical appraisals were not far behind, in step with a shift in education markets towards visual culture, curatorial and exhibition studies, away from a traditional art history that was sceptical of the figure it coolly regarded as gatekeeper, impresario, or even mere influencer, but seldom as an equal researcher. There are, of course, exceptions, but I think we're all probably familiar with this skepticism on the part of art historians. Ambivalent disdain and distrust was the phrase that Patrick Flores used in this publication. Academic art historians like to think they're above the cut and thrust of the contemporary art world and market. Curators, for their part, whatever they might think of art history, have nothing to lose by drawing on it. They've simply done their homework, whereas the historian, citing curators, may seem to be keeping up with things, but doesn't gain anything academically. And this is my first point, the asymmetry between art historical and curatorial currency. Let's not pretend that we're all bringing different kinds of knowledge to a big table at which we all dine together for free. The art historian's feigned indifference to the curator scarcely conceals the latter's challenge to the former. They're fundamentally in competition in the work of making artworks valuable. So in places where art history is a weak institution, curators gain an even greater power. In 2009, I moved from Thailand, where I'd been an independent curator, to Singapore, where my day job, at least, was more like an art historian's. Though there was barely a market to speak of in either country, independence meant demonstrably different things in each. In Thailand, distance from the state academic system, which wasn't hard because that system, although it claimed to produce contemporary art, had zero interest in curation. In Singapore, by contrast, curators were rapidly being enlisted on the state payroll in new and growing institutions. Freelancing was possible only for the very rich and practically illegal for foreigners like myself. Independence there meant an academic job and opening a gallery. But if Southeast Asia still felt like a curatorial frontier zone earlier this century, what we did to pay the rent was probably not so different from elsewhere. The line between non-profit and commercial was blurring everywhere. If artists still weren't sure what we were good for, we were valued as organisers, reporters, and as guides to scenes just off the edge of contemporary art's expanding map. But the picture was different from the West in one important sense, at least: the curator's interface with power, which had been central not just in the profession's emergence in the non-communist post-colonies of the 70s and 80s, but in the very constitution of Southeast Asian contemporary art as such, as an historical object and a market in the 90s. The curator exemplified tensions between new middle classes and their states, to which contemporary art generally was giving expression. As I was increasingly invited to talk about Southeast Asia in the West, nation was always the elephant in the room. Nobody wanted to talk about it, except, of course, the other native informants from the non-West. For the charismatic intermediaries priming art's global circulation were supposed to be independent of nations, an assumption that made sense in the affluent European welfare state thanks to the programmatic regionalism of a post-war social democratic consensus that gave contemporary art its biggest common market. One didn't escape politics exactly, but certainly we're talking here about a separation of curatorial from national bureaucratic interests. Selection and presentation no longer monopolised by the museum, the more agile Kunsthalle, typically not collection-based, was a stepping stone. Curation began to move to its own rhythm, becoming fundamental to contemporary art's circulation as an exemplary kind of global exchange. But for its Asian subspecies, the frameworks of trust, expertise, and authority varied hugely from place to place. One of few constants, regionally speaking, was its not quite independent and ambivalent relation to nation, at once affirmative and deconstructive, as Flores put it. Asia's independent curators were international, but not post-national. Though a kind of vanguard, they were also disarming the more radical gestures of contemporary art and harnessing it for the purposes of an evolving national form. Now, this, I would say, is a key difference between Euro-American contemporaneity and that of a region where, in the 1970s, no nation was more than 30 years old. Their mobility was also different from the nomadism of their global peers. However adept with foreign vocabulary, few handled much foreign product. none of Flores's pioneers, Patrick identifies 4 individuals in that book, none of Flores's pioneer curators ever held a steady job outside of their home nation. They gained international traction as geographically defined specialists. You couldn't say this of a Hans Ulrich Obrist or of a Catherine David or of a Nicolas Bourriot, whose expertise had already, by the mid-90s at least, come to be understood as global. And despite the burgeoning exchange since, very few Southeast Asian curators have become orbital in that European sense. They're less authorial too, tending towards the summary rather than the essay, often serving as local aggregators, streamlining the supply chain for larger surveys elsewhere. In other words, the contemporaneity announced by the Asian curator wasn't quite the contemporaneity sought by a Western curatorium. The Venice Biennale may not be where we look for a curatorial vanguard, but it might bear consideration in this context as the one platform on which all curators are subject to national agendas. For the established Asians, Korea and Japan, curatorial and bureaucratic confidence fluctuate with the political weather, as in other developed countries. But of Asia's emerging powers, the PRC, the ROC, Hong Kong, Southeast Asia, who's done well in Venice? The most consistent by far have been the Republic of China and Hong Kong, and I often wonder whether their unrealised national premises might have something to do with their success. The Southeast Asians, for their part, have been rather patchy. Singapore has had its ups and downs. Eugene Tan made a decent fist of Lim Sei Chuen in 2005. That was their 3rd go in Venice. Then, after successes with Ming Wong and Ho Tzu Nyen, 2009, 2011, they pulled out, fearing that they might have exhausted their pool of artists. What nonsense. It was a failure of curatorial initiative. I witnessed then the comeback in 2015, where a fraught curator was squashed between an expectant global professional audience and his unworldly bureaucratic masters. But a more fruitful observation came from an intensive curating lab run by the National University of Singapore Museum, in which, at the time as a moonlighting gallerist, I had the awkward title of institutional mentor. My students made a project that was a history of curating in Singapore. But after months spent racking their brains and combing half a century of art history for salient or outstanding shows, they came up almost empty-handed, with only an avuncular genealogy of parochial artist organisers and Sunday painters. Indeed, the more it was fleshed out, the harder it became to detect any significant, let alone historically self-conscious, curatorial agency. The students' professional forebears simply didn't conform to received notions of curatorial prowess. No globe-trotting tastemakers, no fly-in, fly-out theorists, no coining of viral buzzwords, no setting of trends in selection or display, and little critically informed writing to their names. No manifestos, no monographs, not even a lousy book of interviews. Clearly, the missing protagonist would have been mobile, internationally visible, and authorial, habitual assumptions separating the contemporary from what came before it. Promoting modern art meant national participation in international trends, where Cold War curators, or articulate artists more often, were charged with presenting works abroad. Success was determined comparatively amongst artists, works, or nations. It had nothing to do with curators, if one was even named. Had Singapore somehow gotten stuck in that mode? Or were my students looking in the wrong places? By 2012, with 6 Venice pavilions under its belt, 3 biennials of its own, a shiny new art fair, museums, and 15 years of voracious regional collecting, Singapore was more and more firmly planted on contemporary art's global map. Could it really have gotten there without curation? Who or what agency had affected the practical and discursive realization of contemporaneity, if not curators? The answer was inescapable. The curatorial function in Singapore had been assumed by the exhibitionary and curatorial state. Now, before I pursue this assumption of curatorial initiative by the state, I should explain perhaps my preference for the word function. A mathematical connotation of function suggests permutations dependent on variables, each input yielding a distinct output, an operation whose basic gesture in a given time and place would be original, responsive perhaps to local situations, but whose product may or may not be greater than the sum of its parts. This connotation of function anticipates an algorithmic one fast becoming natural to us. Here's an alert that I just received on my phone. For some time already, curation has been automated. But perhaps more apposite are the administrative connotations of the functionary, that anonymous vehicle of a discourse, as Foucault put it in his famous lecture of 1969. For the curator's competence as organizer of aesthetic experience rests not just upon negotiation with artists, interpretation for media, and all the socializing, the end of the spectrum where kudos may be one, but which might not take up the most time or energy, but also on no less intensive operations that are far from authorial, with registrars, galleries, shipping agents, preparators and conservators, technicians, regulatory agencies, venues, caterers, accountants, and so on, with bureaucratic systems. However essential these people may be, they have no claim to authorship. This back-end stuff is normally hidden, even from professional viewers. Of course, our burgeoning literature on the mercurial avatar of global neoliberalism has little to say about bureaucracy. But this term suits well, I think, the work of many curators whose names you may have trouble recalling in Southeast Asia's institutions. Bureaucratic is not a compliment. Yet there's nothing inherently mindless about this functionary. And even where they don't understand contemporary curatorial practice or discourse, this doesn't mean they're not performing the curatorial function. The founding director of the Havana Biennial, rejecting what she called curatorial protagonism, insisted on calling the curators researchers, a role that Rachel Weisz characterizes as non-authorial and administrative, if inquisitive. I'm not interested in valorizing these less glamorous sides of curating, but I do want to know whether the curatorial function is fundamentally more authorial than bureaucratic. Are we not encouraged to overestimate the authorial side of things by the term's sheer popularity, by the global spectacle of contemporary art, by the emerging discipline of curatorial studies? Surely our independent curator cannot not be an author, can hardly be anything but an author. Is their function like Foucault's author function? Must the curator be named publicly as maker of the exhibition, or can it be authored anonymously? And are these qualifications the same everywhere? The obvious professional model announced itself the same year as Foucault's lecture, in Harold Siemens' celebrated exhibition at the Kunsthalle Bern and his subsequent resignation from that institution. No one has doubted his authorial capacity then or since. Was it not his very challenge to the authorial priority of artists that so upset particularly the Americans in his Documenta 5 in 1972? Situating Foucault's essay in the context of wider challenges to the sovereign subject of the Enlightenment, it's bound to seem less accidental that the independent curator, so-called, emerges from the exact same historical conditions. But can our curatorial subject, as Foucault would demand, be, and I quote, be stripped of its creative role and analysed as a complex and variable function of discourse? For now, I can only address Foucault's criteria in a schematic way. Yet I think it will be clear that those conditions are not the ones that furnished a curatorial function in Asia. First, is the curator's work appropriable? A status that he says depends on its being policeable as transgressive. This question already imposes a concrete geopolitical relativity. Curatorial history is shaped by specific regimes of power, enacted by way of censorship, regulation, collection, funding, academic instruction, and so forth. And though the independent curator's appearance in the West and in the rest was roughly contemporaneous, in authoritarian and post-authoritarian Asia, censorship was and continues to be routine, though it's not always the state itself responsible for it. A pretty random selection of cases, just to bear out the point. These are all cases where you could say that the censorship was in some sense not direct. We would have to deal with self-censorship. This is a work censored by the curator Apinan Posianon. So self-censorship, in that case imposed by way of a supposedly autonomous university. Moving roughly clockwise, the Artists' General Assembly in the end of 1993 in Singapore, the famous Fifth Passage incident that led to a roughly 10-year ban on performance art and unscripted forms of theatre, was driven by state-owned newspapers. 18 years later, the Simon Fujiwara experience, in which case a museum did the deed on behalf of a biennale. Jim Supankat's CP Biennale, Centre Bottom. This is a work that was censored from, in fact, sparked the closure of that biennale, was shut down by religious mobsters whose hold on the Indonesian state has only increased since. And a recent case here, which I'm sure everyone here is familiar with, from a rich liberal democracy, part of the current Aichi triennial, closed due to threats from nationalist zealots. The dirty work in that case, again, outsourced to non-state actors. Now, Foucault's question about appropriation has broader implications too. Is the curator's work a kind of property? Though its legal status, I think, has rarely been tested, it's generally not reproducible. It embodies a tension then between two kinds of authorship, one belonging to the era of print, the other to the electronic age, for the curator's currency is tied to the unrepeatability of the exhibition, or if you prefer, the project. And however apposite, does not this word project imply its very contingency, its specificity in time and place? Historically, the curator accompanies the so-called drive to the live, recombinatory or DJ culture, and the resurgent value of unique events in the so-called experience economy. Patrick Flores uses the Philippine slang eventologist. The curator is a database artist or aggregator, yet their value proposition is time-based, germane to the comeback economy of vinyl records and the artisanal pour-over coffee. And this also goes some way towards explaining their affinity with festival, with biennials at least, the contemporary's primary exhibitionary form. Curatorial products in our global culture, let's say since the 90s, are unreproducible. We don't see too many indignant accusations of theft, not that the product, of course, isn't repetitive, for like any successful authoring, there's always market pressure to repeat. For some curators, that will mean maintaining an obvious stable of artists or recycling concepts from one project to another. But the ties to artists are not exclusive, and the concepts are in the efflux. They're shareware. It's easy to appropriate another curator's text, in Foucault's sense of the word text. It's just hard to profit from it, because curatorial currency is tied up with personal charisma, as much or even more than with the text. Foucault's third criterion, authorship isn't a spontaneous attribution. The mere existence of my project doesn't make me ipso facto its author. Nor am I its author because I say so. Rather, I become its author by way of precise and complex procedures, interpolation, by other actors, institutions, etc. These interpolations, fourthly, give rise to multiple subjective positions, to plural egos. At any given vernissage, I am simultaneously impatient organiser, distracted host, semi-informed tour guide, solicitous artist whisperer, grateful grant recipient, accidental preparator, public intellectual, anthropologue, salesman, you name it. You'll recognise this salad of responsibilities. Foucault's second criterion is pivotal. The author function is not universal or constant. We have to insist on this relativity, our culture. The function of the author, the functioning of the author function, is specific to a given culture. And this is not the only a priori necessary for the function to function. Foucault challenges the priority accorded authors with respect to works. You have to have an author before you can have a work. By showing that before you can have an author, you have to have something else, discourse. The author, quote, serves a circulation of discourses. And as discourses and their circulation are historical and dynamic, so too is the author function. Even within our civilization, he writes, the same types of texts have not always required authors. Fairy tales, for instance, which for centuries circulate without an author, but then later have one ascribed to them. So Foucault's function accommodates a dilation, a widening. It describes a concatenation of subject positions that sometimes do and sometimes don't cohere in the figure of an individual curator, but which always formulate and circulate discourses, a work given substance by the recognition of legal, economic, and other institutional regimes. Thus, the curatorial function may operate where no curator is curating, or is named as such, and even where the curatorial role has been deliberately eschewed. Southeast Asian contemporary art history demands this widening beyond the individual in at least three ways. First, very briefly, the region's modern art, to say nothing of its pre-modern traditions, is rich in examples of what I've just called an ascriptive, ascribed authorship, the notion of an authorship consigned to someone else. I'll come back to this point at the end. Second, the first people in the region to assume the curatorial mantle, in the contemporary sense, Patrick Flores's pioneers, were all artists. They were all trained as artists, that is, already called to authorship in another mode. Thirdly, in the widespread collectivization of the curatorial function by groups, particularly artist-run spaces and festivals, the main incubators of contemporaneity. The transnational artist-run festivals of the early 90s, for example, were largely not curated. All of them considered and rejected the appointment of curators. None of Flores's artist-curator pioneers were involved or really the driving forces in these festivals. Not in the Baguio Arts Guild's International Art Festival in the Philippines, not in the Artist Village in Singapore, nor in Chiang Mai Social Installation in northern Thailand. Now, in my Foucauldian reckoning here, these groups did perform the curatorial function. They just resisted its reification in a figure whose power and charisma would come to stand apart, perhaps over and against, the power and charisma of artists. But they nevertheless circulated the discursive currencies elsewhere circulated by curators. an achievement that secured their independence for years from the state institutions that were to yoke the curator more and more effectively from this point on. So why call them curatorial if they refuse the title themselves? Well, because we might thus dislodge assumptions about what that role entails, suspending any easy synthesis between the Asian curator and a global, or if you like, Western model, and gain in the process some comparative purchase across different art worlds that together engendered a contemporaneity that was both regional and global. Though I began today with the tight knot between the curator and contemporaneity, I think where this work is pointing is to a decoupling of those concepts insofar as the curatorial function specific to Asia might lead us beyond the contemporary's usual habitats. We might uncover the same authorial bureaucratic agency, for instance, similar kinds of discursive work in other times and other places. Even if the two terms are interdependent, should we not qualify contemporaneity too outside the parameters set by Euro-American theory? Very briefly, I have to underscore this is research I haven't done yet, so I shouldn't really be showing this. But here's a sort of thought experiment in a given national context, that of Japan. What would the curatorial function look like historically in Japan, a country that was the unrivaled discursive powerhouse of Asian modernity, but not really of Asian contemporaneity? Right, so here's a way of sort of separating. Such a perspective could reset both the chronologies and the geographies of art history. Those of you familiar with these characters here will probably know that they make quite strange bedfellows in some cases. But if the curatorial function can accommodate the ideologue Okakura, the vanguard publisher-poet and war apologist Kitasono, and the die-hard leftist critic Ichiro Haryu, as well as the ones now responsible, if you like, for Japan's stake in international contemporaneity, then what might that encompassment tell us about the curatorial function in that place or in that history? Now, I want to close today by returning to my earlier provocation about a curatorial state. One could well imagine, of course, a history of curation, a critical history of curation, extending, say, Patrick Flores's cohort of critical engineers of national form. But my little Singapore story suggested that we focus on the state's instrumentalization of curators, at risk of underestimating the state's own, often formidable, curatorial mandate. In Stalinism, Boris Groys recognised a fundamentally vanguardist demand, I quote him, a demand that art should cease representing life and begin transforming it by means of a total aesthetico-political project. Southeast Asia's totalitarian experiments didn't leave much by way of visual art, yet that same demand resounds in the region in the license artistic innovators have taken in league with political principles to ignore the tastes of the people and create for the state a new political subject and a new people. These are Groys terms. Now, if we're not too picky about the art forms that takes, then this was discernible right across nation-building Southeast Asia. Indeed, the more we look at the region's modern art, the more we sense that curation was there all along, and on a truly massive scale, usually working in the name of nation. Examples are rife in the so-called developmental art patronised by the conjugal dictatorship of the Marcoses in the Philippines and the vanguard programming of Imelda's Cultural Centre of the Philippines in the dictatorship era. This is just one example one could identify. I think the same international outlook is very obvious in the architecture of that institution. In Sihanouk's deployments of photography, of spectacular mass assembly, and especially of film and architecture, these are a few screen grabs hastily stolen from YouTube of a film made by the king himself. The king, as some of you may know, was an avid cineast. This is in fact after he has abdicated officially, but nevertheless is controlling a studio, bureaucratically funded film studio. This is in fact his daughter here performing the role of the Apsara. Or in Sukarno's patronage, collection and commissioning of nationalist modernism in Indonesia. And if the vanguard post-colonial states of the 60s and 70s are a thing of the past, there is at least one place where the utopian ambition of total societal transformation survives today, in a state aesthetico-political project. That is, of course, in Singapore. Now, if the nation has been a curatorial force in its own right, then our histories must account for both the curator as instrument of the state and for the state itself as an inherently exhibitionary agency, with its own purchase on the curatorial function and the contemporary values unlocked by it, values once branded modern. To take this curatorial state seriously, we should look beyond visual art, museums, biennials, to a much wider economy of appearances and sovereign exhibitionism, in which audiences bore witness to a modernity with both contemporary and global pretensions. The curatorial function may even be a primary responsibility of Southeast Asian government as such, articulating the absorption of neighbouring populations by the political centre is perhaps the oldest habit of Southeast Asian state-making. But at the same time, these centres authored epic visions of worldliness, certainly no less cosmopolitan than today's biennales. In accounting for the transnational dimension of contemporary art, we too often pretend that it's new. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for your always provocative and productive talk. Just precisely like 3 years ago, I was attending your class at US. So it's quite an honor to respond to your presentation, but also a sense of challenging, afraid, precisely like my term paper didn't hit the central questions. Let me just provide a brief summary of David's extremely, I think, urgent and timely presentation on the subject of curatorial functions. Specifically responds to also a great, I think, provocation to this particular event, thinking about, I mean, in fact, the production of curators. In this case, Taiwanese curators, and what does that mean? I think that's a very essential question we need to think about, and for all that is here, for everyone's here who have the plan to, you know, pursue a career as a curator, what exactly is the entanglement and the power relationship in this particular terms called curator? Okay, so you start with thinking about the function of curator, but in fact, the function for whom? curator juxtapose, the juxtaposition between curator and art historian. And this is a battle of value, but then what kind of value we are discussing here? By answering that question, you take us to visit the neoliberal essence in the name of curator. And what does this neoliberal essence conversely reconfigure its original habitus, which we call art history? So here, David, you set up a great grand departure of what we know of curator today, those start curators and those independent curators, and what exactly is in that particular notion of independency. So you, in fact, demystify this notion of independency within its economic and political circulations of this term of contemporary. Then you revisit where we both now live and work, so which is a very pressing conversation also in this particular point, because in fact the production of curator has very much the state agenda of the lovely nation of Garden by the Bay, Singapore. So through this particular case, curator and the state, the differentiation on the arrival of contemporaneity in art. So what you lead us to then is this particular question on how power has performed a ventriloquism and through the mechanical function of curatorship in relation to state. And I think great case for Singapore, it's its grand plan of Renaissance City, which just finished the first phase of this city-state planning project through arts and culture. And this is a state where in the moment of its independency or its departure from Malaya, the leading figure, the state initial this culture planning, start to play the role of curator, start to play a role of culture. It seems like there's nothing within the everyday life. It demands a production of culture and arts through this very intriguing and problematic term called instant Asia. So this is a term which culture has a particular interconnection with economic demand and the surviving of the nation. So you then arrive to your highlight, I think the highlight of your presentation, by taking us to revisit Michel Foucault's idea, a classical essay titled What is the Author? Amazing essay that's, if we can pin it down in one sentence, it will probably be: the author is in fact the product of the discourse. In that sense, what exactly is the discourse we are talking about? And what's the power of discourse we are thinking if we replace the word author with the word curator or curatorialship? And in a sense, if what Foucault is trying to contextualize or deconstruct is this idea of knowledge, I think what you have taken us to is in fact the deconstruct of curatorialship and how it has itself come into being in relation to state, in relation to several different cases, from Biennale to the local context. So here you end this particular section with an extremely productive cross-regional reference of curatorialship and the state with Japan. I think it is productive in a sense because you really very much pointed out the nation state is a very young idea. Not only is it a very young idea, we all share a different moment and different timing in terms of state building processes and how it has taken us to. Japan is a classical case. We're thinking about probably the first Asian curator, Okakura Tensen, who was trained and cultivated through, the curatorialship is very much practiced through the building of the Asian collection in Boston Art Museum, and came back and have this amazing, relationship with Tagore from India. So again, this is a very intriguing notion that's thinking about how the kind of aesthetical, nationalistic Lucien has played this, I use this word ventriloquism, through this idea of curator, and how this pursuit of nation could potentially become a trap, even though it really claimed the promise of decolonization, particularly in the region of Southeast Asia, right? You end your presentation with this wonderful voyage through all this great kings and presidents play the role of curator. I really love that section, particularly for, I think, the dear lovely Imelda Marcus and her grandiose, the performance and performative curatorialship of all the cultural institutions. But again, quite, I will have to say, pessimistic, or even realistic picture, thinking about Asian contemporaneity, or the division between contemporary and modern. Where is this particular separation comes from? And unfortunately, or fortunately, the promise of the nation and its decolonization may not be the precise answer we are talking about here. So to sum up, it's truly a lovely presentation, and I think very urgent presentation for all of us. I mean, I'm now working in the institution, although we are not belong to the state mechanism. But still, what exactly is the kind of historical legacies we're dealing with? Although the collection in relation to museum is not part of your concern in this presentation, but still, I mean, what exactly is the function of curator in relation to power? To extend the subject of power concerning the curatorialship, maybe we can revisit the politics of exhibition and its essence of, borrowing a word from Mikhail Bao, an epistematic authority, the kind of how curator played the mediator and facilitator for this particular sense of attentiveness. So you go into a particular gallery spaces. Let me bring it back to, again, the gallery spaces. And because it's precisely about the relationship between object, artwork, history, the kind of semiotic relationship we're building through word and object of wording capacities. If the means of curatorialship has to do with this entanglement between political, economical, and aesthetical, nationalistic discourse, to what extent can the notion of art and aesthetic still be said to destabilize the question of power? Do you think the work of art still valid in this dissolving political potential of curator and curatorialship, or even curatorial practice, if we broaden this notion of curatorial? If yes, how the curatorial practice could be, resituated in this particular conversation? I mean, to long story short, it's a question about, do we still have hope? We still have another day on the conversation of curator and curatorialship. So what's next for us if it's such a complex power mechanism we're dealing with?
Thank you for a very thoughtful engagement. Yes, there's hope. Is there room for art to still destabilize the programs of nation as they might be exhibited in the way that I've described? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I would say that there's two ways. Firstly, within precisely those institutional framings. And this, I think, you know, my revisiting the work of Patrick Flores, who I think his book is still the only real history of contemporaneity where Southeast Asia is concerned, that's specific to that region. You know, I think it's telling that it's telling the story of curators. But I think, you know, I revisit it in certainly wanting to endorse his research far more than criticise it. Where I depart from it is that I think there is perhaps in that study and reflecting a broader set of interests in the, you know, in curatorial discourse, if I may use an ugly abstraction. I think it comes from a good place, right? In the spirit of professionalizing that role, right? It's in the spirit of identifying a professional persona that wasn't really there before, right? And to come back to your opening remarks, this, you know, this is why we're all here, right? I mean, there is a pedagogical question, I think, that looms over us in a meeting like this. You know, how should curators be trained? Should they even be trained? I mean, this, you know, the upshot of Patrick's study, that early book, is that they're not trained, right? And the key architects of contemporaneity, according to that story, in let's say the 90s and 2000s in Southeast Asia, were precisely not trained curators. You know, and I often find myself saying to younger would-be curators, you know, do you need to go and do an MA in Goldsmiths? I'm not sure. So, I mean, I think there's one way is that within existing kind of institutional avenues, one can nevertheless always still queer that nationalism, right? And I think that's precisely what your boss at NUS Museum has been doing with his program, right? There is a very strong and strident national curatorial discourse in the air in Singapore. Anybody who visits for a biennale or an art fair or whatever will smell it right away. And I think there are small pockets of activity, curatorial activity in Singapore that are very deliberately unsettling those narratives. And so, yes, I think it's possible, and I think it's urgent. I think it's important that institutions still harbour that breadth, right, that latitude of unpicking and problematizing those national stories. I mean, the relationship between NUS Museums program and the NGS, the big national museums program, I think is a case study waiting to be done there. But also, I think outside of it, I mean, I think this is the sort of professional answer, if you like, within the professional cocoon. Yes, I do think it's possible. I think there are models around of people who do it very well. But I also think that the other answer leads us back to the question of independence. How does one qualify one's independence practicing this métier? You know, and this is something that, as I was suggesting, is very different in different places. I think it behooves us as curators to articulate those qualifications, to make legible, as it were, what latitudes are available to us. How can we become independent? In my case, I mean, a lot of this, as you picked up, you know, was sort of driven by personal experience. Loath though I am to offer a curatorial memoir, I certainly will never publish anything like that. But you know, in my personal experience, I have seen exactly this, that you land in one place and all of a sudden the whole idea of independence crumbles around you. You know, and Singapore, you can have that feeling no matter who you are or where you come from. You know, the speed and the sophistication with which one's ideas are instrumentalized in a place like that, you know, is breathtaking. So I think even in those places, and perhaps especially in those places, or especially in those situations,
we have a professional responsibility to restate and re-interrogate the terms of our independence, if indeed we claim some independence.
Thank you for Yi-Zhen for being the time police woman here. Thank you, David, to wrap it up, this wonderful presentation and my curiosity with a small teeny sense of hope. Yes, our museum are mostly picking up exhibition directions are those who never been or never will be presented by National Gallery in this particular sense. So I hope the audiences have loads of questions after this conversation and David's wonderful presentation. Please write down your questions. We'll have a roundtable discussion afterward at the end of the day. So please address your concern or any questions about this conversation towards the end of today. And thank you, David, for your wonderful presentation. Yes, and taking time out and finish your your presentation. So I think we'll have a few minutes break, 7 minutes break, and I will see you. That's the break time. Yes, we will see you back after 7 minutes. Yeah, thank you.